Just throw it in the trash, old man." The words hung in the air of the gun shop like a slap across the face. 78-year-old Walter Hensley stood at the counter, cradling a rust-covered rifle wrapped in an old blanket, while the young gunsmith behind the counter didn't even bother to hide his smirk. "I'm serious," the kid continued, barely glancing at the corroded metal. "That thing is beyond saving. You'd be wasting your money and my time. Besides, restoration work like that is way above your pay grade, Gramps." Walter said nothing. He simply wrapped the rifle back in its blanket with hands that trembled slightly, not from weakness, but from a quiet fury he hadn't felt in decades. What that arrogant young man didn't know was that he had just insulted one of the most skilled gunsmiths in American military history. A man whose hands had built weapons for presidents and restored firearms that museums now display behind glass. If you believe that skill and experience deserve respect, type craftsmanship in the comments before we continue. Walter Hensley lived alone in a modest farmhouse outside of Lexington, Virginia, the same house where he had been born 78 years earlier and where he had returned after his wife, Dorothy, passed away 5 winters ago. The property had belonged to his family for 4 generations, a 30-acre spread of rolling hills and old oak trees that Walter maintained with the same meticulous care he applied to everything in his life. His days followed a simple rhythm: coffee at dawn, tending his vegetable garden, reading history books in the afternoon sun, and falling asleep in his worn leather chair while classical music played softly from an old radio. To his neighbours, Walter was a kind but private man who waved from his porch and occasionally shared tomatoes from his garden. None of them knew about the decades he'd spent in a classified military workshop. None of them knew about the awards and commendations locked away in his attic. And none of them knew that the calloused hands that now pulled weeds from between tomato plants had once been considered national treasures. It was a Tuesday morning in early October when Walter's shovel struck something metallic buried beneath his garden soil. He had been expanding his vegetable patch, breaking new ground in an area that had been untouched for as long as he could remember, when the distinctive clang of steel against steel stopped him mid-swing. Curiosity overtook him as he knelt down, his old knees protesting, and began carefully excavating the object with his hands. What emerged from the Virginia clay was barely recognizable as a rifle. Rust had consumed nearly every visible surface, transforming what was once precision-engineered steel into a corroded mass of orange and brown. The wooden stock had rotted away almost entirely, leaving only fragments clinging to the rusted frame. The barrel was so encrusted with oxidation that Walter couldn't even determine its caliber at first glance. Any reasonable person would have dismissed it as scrap, a relic too far gone to salvage. But Walter Hensley was not any reasonable person, and as he turned the rusted hulk in his hands, his trained eyes began to see something that most people would have missed entirely. Here is something fascinating that most people don't understand about firearms corrosion and what actually happens when steel rusts. Rust, scientifically known as iron oxide, forms when iron or steel is exposed to oxygen and moisture over extended periods. The process is called oxidation, and it creates a layer of reddish-brown material that appears to consume the metal beneath. However, and this is crucial for understanding restoration, rust doesn't necessarily destroy the underlying steel. In many cases, especially with high-quality firearm steel, the corrosion forms a protective layer that actually slows further degradation. The rust you see on the surface might be hiding perfectly sound metal underneath, like an ugly cocoon protecting something beautiful within. This is why experienced gunsmiths never dismiss a rusted firearm without proper examination. The difference between a piece of scrap and a priceless antique often comes down to what lies beneath that oxidized surface, and determining that requires knowledge, patience, and skills that take decades to develop. Walter carried the rifle to his workshop, a converted barn that sat behind his farmhouse and hadn't been properly used in over 15 years. When he opened the doors, dust motes swirled in the morning light, illuminating rows of tools that had once been the instruments of his life's work. Lathes and milling machines stood silent under canvas covers. Racks of hand tools lined the walls, each one hung in its designated place with military precision. Bottles of chemicals and oils sat on shelves, their labels faded but still legible to eyes that had read them 10,000 times. Walter ran his fingers along a workbench that had supported some of the most delicate restoration work ever performed on American soil, and for a moment he felt the weight of all those years pressing down on him. He was too old for this, he told himself. His hands weren't steady enough anymore, His eyes weren't sharp enough. Dorothy would have told him to let it go, to enjoy his retirement, to stop trying to prove something to a world that had forgotten him. But as he set the rusted rifle on the bench and began his initial examination, something stirred in Walter's chest that he hadn't felt in a very long time. The first step in any restoration is identification, determining exactly what you're working with before you touch a single tool. Walter spent 2 hours that first day simply studying the rifle, using magnifying glasses and measuring instruments to gather information from the corroded remains. The overall length, approximately 43 inches, told him something. The general shape of the receiver suggested an era. The location and style of certain mounting points hinted at manufacturer. And then, buried beneath layers of rust on the left side of the receiver, Walter found what he was looking for: the faint impression of markings that had been stamped into the steel over a century ago. His heart began to race as he carefully cleaned a small section with mineral spirits and fine brass wool. The letters emerged slowly, ghosts from another age. Springfield Armory, followed by Model 1903. Walter sat back in his chair, suddenly understanding exactly what he had unearthed from his garden, and exactly why this restoration would matter. The Springfield Model 1903 is one of the most significant rifles in American military history, and here is why every firearms enthusiast and history buff should understand its importance. Developed at the Springfield Armory in Massachusetts and officially adopted in 1903, this bolt-action rifle served as the primary infantry weapon of the United States military through both World Wars. Its design was revolutionary for its time, incorporating a Mauser-style action that provided exceptional accuracy and reliability under combat conditions. The 1903 Springfield fired the .30-06 cartridge, a round so effective that it remained the standard American military caliber for nearly 50 years. During World War I, American doughboys carried the 1903 through the trenches of France, and its reputation for accuracy made it the preferred weapon of early military snipers. By World War II, while the M1 Garand had become the standard infantry rifle, the 1903 continued to serve in specialized roles, particularly as a sniper platform. Finding one buried in Virginia soil raised immediate questions. How did it get there? Who had carried it? And what stories had it witnessed before ending up forgotten beneath Walter's garden? Despite his initial examination, Walter knew that a proper restoration of this magnitude was beyond what he should attempt at his age. The project would require weeks of painstaking work, specialized chemicals, and a steady hand that he wasn't sure he still possessed. So he made what seemed like a reasonable decision. He would take the rifle to a professional shop and have someone else do the work. There was a place in town called Precision Arms, run by a young man named Tyler Brennan, who had taken over from his father a few years back. Walter wrapped the rifle carefully in an old wool blanket, placed it in his truck, and drove the 12 miles into Lexington with the optimism of a man who simply wanted to see a piece of history saved. He did not expect what would happen when he walked through those doors. Tyler Brennan was 29 years old and had inherited Precision Arms when his father retired to Florida 3 years earlier. He had learned gunsmithing at a technical school in Pennsylvania and considered himself an expert in modern firearms, particularly the tactical rifles and custom pistols that brought in most of his revenue. Historical restorations bored him, frankly, and he had little patience for the old-timers who occasionally wandered in with their grandfather's hunting rifles expecting miracles. When the elderly man in worn overalls walked through his door carrying something wrapped in a blanket, Tyler barely looked up from his phone. "Help you?" he asked without enthusiasm. Walter carefully unwrapped the rifle on the counter, revealing the rust-covered remains to the fluorescent lights of the shop. "I found this buried on my property," he explained. "It's a 1903 Springfield, and I was hoping you might be able to restore it." Tyler glanced at the corroded metal for perhaps 3 seconds before letting out a dismissive laugh. "You're joking, right?" Tyler said, finally setting down his phone to give the old man his full attention, though not the respectful kind. "Look at this thing. It's completely destroyed. The rust goes all the way through, guaranteed. You'd have to be crazy to waste money trying to fix this, and honestly, I'd have to be crazy to take your money for it." Walter's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice measured. The rust is surface oxidation. The underlying steel could still be sound. If you did a proper electrolysis treatment and careful examination— "Electrolysis?" Tyler interrupted with another laugh. "Grandpa, I don't know what YouTube videos you've been watching, but that's not how this works. Even if by some miracle the metal wasn't completely compromised, You're looking at hundreds of hours of work. The stock is gone entirely. Half the small parts are probably missing. And for what? A rifle that might blow up in someone's face if they tried to fire it? He pushed the wrapped bundle back across the counter toward Walter. My advice? Throw it in the trash and save yourself the embarrassment. This is beyond saving, and to be honest, restoration work like this is way above your pay grade, Gramps. Walter stood in that gun shop looking at the young man who'd just dismissed decades of knowledge with a careless wave of his hand, and he felt something shift inside him. It wasn't anger, exactly, though anger was certainly part of it. It was something more fundamental, a rejection of the idea that age meant incompetence, that experience meant nothing compared to youth, that a man's life work could be erased by a few years of retirement. Walter had spent 43 years as a master gunsmith for the United States military, working in facilities so classified that even his wife had never known exactly what he did. He had restored firearms that belonged to presidents, generals, and historical figures whose names appeared in every American textbook. He had been consulted by the Smithsonian, by private collectors worth billions, by foreign governments seeking expertise that simply didn't exist anywhere else. And now a 29-year-old with a technical certificate was telling him that restoration was above his pay grade. Walter wrapped the rifle back in its blanket without saying another word. He walked out of Precision Arms with a quiet determination that Tyler Brennan completely failed to recognize. The young gunsmith had no idea that he had just issued a challenge to one of the few men alive who could actually meet it. That evening, Walter sat in his workshop with the rusted Springfield laid out before him, and he made a decision. He would restore this rifle himself. Not because he had anything to prove to that arrogant young man, though that was certainly a factor. He would do it because the rifle deserved it. Because somewhere in the past an American soldier had carried this weapon, had trusted his life to its function, had perhaps fought and bled while holding its stock. That soldier's story might be lost to history, but the rifle could still be saved, could still stand as a testament to craftsmanship and service, and the enduring quality of things built to last. Walter looked at his hands, spotted with age and slightly trembling, and he wondered if they still remembered the skills that had once made them famous. There was only one way to find out. The first stage of any serious restoration is documentation, and Walter approached this with the methodical precision that had defined his entire career. He photographed the rifle from every angle, creating a complete visual record of its pre-restoration condition. He measured every dimension with calipers and micrometers, recording numbers in a leather notebook with handwriting that remained surprisingly steady. He catalogued every visible part, noting which components were present, which were missing, and which were damaged beyond simple repair. This documentation serves multiple purposes. It provides a roadmap for the restoration process, creates a historical record for future reference, and establishes authenticity for rifles that may have significant value. Walter's documentation process took an entire day, but when he finished, he had a complete understanding of exactly what lay before him. The rifle was missing its stock entirely, its rear sight assembly, several screws and pins, and the leather sling that would have originally been attached. But the critical components, the receiver, barrel, bolt assembly, and trigger mechanism, all appeared to be present beneath the rust. The question was whether they could be saved. Electrolysis, the process that young Tyler had dismissed so casually, is actually one of the most effective methods for removing rust from ferrous metals. Here is how it works, because understanding the science makes the achievement even more impressive. When you submerge a rusted steel object in a solution of water and washing soda, then connect it to a source of direct current electricity with the rusted object as the cathode, a chemical reaction occurs. The electrical current causes the oxygen molecules in the rust to separate from the iron, effectively reversing the oxidation process that created the corrosion in the first place. The rust doesn't simply fall off, it is chemically converted back to its base elements. This process is gentle enough that it doesn't damage sound underlying metal, yet effective enough to remove even decades of heavy corrosion. Walter had built his own electrolysis tank 30 years ago, a large plastic container with copper electrodes and a variable power DC power supply. It had sat unused in his workshop since his retirement, but when he tested it, the old equipment worked perfectly. He disassembled the rifle completely, cataloguing and labeling each part, then submerged the major components in the electrolysis solution. The restoration had officially begun. The electrolysis process ran for 3 full days, with Walter checking the progress every few hours and adjusting the current as needed. What emerged from that tank was remarkable. The receiver, which had appeared to be a solid mass of corrosion, was actually in excellent condition beneath the rust. The machining marks from the Springfield Armory were still crisp and clear. The serial number, once he cleaned the area carefully, was fully legible. 456789, indicating manufacture in early 1918, during the height of American involvement in World War I. The barrel, too, had survived far better than expected. When Walter examined the bore with a bore scope, he found the rifling still sharp and well defined, suggesting the rifle had seen relatively little actual use before being buried. The bolt assembly required more extensive cleaning, as rust had frozen several components together. But careful application of penetrating oil and gentle heating freed the stuck parts without damage. Each revelation strengthened Walter's conviction that this rifle was worth saving, that beneath the neglect and corrosion lay a piece of American history waiting to be reborn. Here is something most people don't realize about the skill required for firearms restoration and why it takes decades to truly master. Unlike simple repair work, restoration requires understanding not just how a firearm functions, but how it was originally manufactured, what materials were used, what techniques were employed, and what the finished product should look and feel like. A true restoration must be historically accurate, using period-appropriate methods and materials whenever possible. It must be mechanically sound, ensuring the weapon functions safely and reliably. And it must be aesthetically correct, matching the original appearance so closely that only an expert could distinguish the restored piece from one that survived intact. This combination of historical knowledge, mechanical expertise, and artistic skill is extraordinarily rare. There are perhaps a few hundred people in the world capable of performing museum-quality firearms restorations, and Walter Hensley had trained many of them personally during his years of government service. The young gunsmith who had dismissed his abilities had no conception of the gulf between his own skills and those of the old man he had mocked. With the metal components cleaned and assessed, Walter turned his attention to the most challenging aspect of the restoration, recreating the wooden stock. The original walnut stock had rotted away almost entirely, leaving only fragments that provided clues about the original configuration, but nothing usable for the restoration itself. Creating a new stock from scratch is one of the most demanding tasks in gunsmithing, requiring woodworking skills that few modern practitioners possess. Walter began by selecting the wood, choosing a piece of American black walnut that he had been aging in his workshop for over 20 years. The grain pattern was tight and straight, ideal for a military rifle stock, and the wood had been properly dried to prevent future warping or cracking. Using the original fragments as a guide, along with detailed measurements from reference materials, Walter began the painstaking process of shaping a new stock by hand. He worked with traditional tools, rasps, files, chisels, and scrapers, shaping the wood gradually over many hours until it matched the original 1903 Springfield specifications exactly. The stock-making process alone took Walter 4 days of continuous work, often stretching late into the night as he refined the fit and finish. Here is what makes this work so demanding. A rifle stock must fit the metal components with near-perfect precision. The barrel must bed into the stock at specific points to ensure accuracy. The trigger guard and floor plate assembly must align exactly with their mortises. The butt plate must attach flush with the end of the stock, and the wood must be shaped to historical specifications while accommodating any unique characteristics of the particular receiver being restored. Every fraction of a millimeter matters. Too tight, and the stock won't assemble properly. Too loose, and the rifle will be inaccurate and unreliable. Walter worked by feel as much as by measurement, using skills that had become instinctive after 4 decades of practice. When he finally test-fitted the metal components into the new stock, everything aligned as perfectly as if they had been manufactured together. The finishing process came next, and this is where Walter's expertise truly shone. Historical accuracy demanded that he replicate the original linseed oil finish used on military Springfield stocks, a time-consuming process that most modern gunsmiths skip in favour of faster synthetic alternatives. True linseed oil finishing requires multiple applications, each rubbed into the wood by hand and allowed to cure before the next coat is applied. The oil penetrates deep into the walnut, sealing and protecting it while allowing the natural grain to show through. Each coat must cure for at least 24 hours, and a proper military-grade finish requires at least 10 coats for adequate protection. Walter applied 15, working the oil into the wood with his bare hands until his fingerprints became part of the rifle's history. The smell of linseed oil filled his workshop, triggering memories of projects completed decades ago, of weapons restored, and soldiers served, and a career dedicated to the preservation of American military heritage. For the metal components, Walter employed traditional cold bluing techniques rather than modern hot tank methods. Here is why this matters. Hot tank bluing is faster and more consistent, but it produces a finish that looks unmistakably modern. Period-correct cold bluing, applied by hand with careful attention to application technique, creates a finish that matches what the rifle would have looked like when it left the Springfield Armory in 1918. The process requires precise temperature control, exact timing, and years of experience to achieve consistent results. Walter worked on each component separately, building up the blued finish in multiple thin layers until the colour-matched reference photographs of original finish 1903 Springfields. The receiver, the barrel, the bolt, the trigger guard assembly all emerge from the process with a deep, rich blue-black finish that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The transformation was stunning, and Walter allowed himself a small smile of satisfaction as he began the final assembly. The last missing pieces were the rear sight assembly and various small parts that had been lost or damaged beyond recovery. Here is where Walter's decades of experience and extensive professional network proved invaluable. He had maintained contacts throughout the firearms restoration community, collectors and dealers who specialized in original military parts. Within a few days, he had sourced a complete original rear sight assembly, manufactured in 1918, that matched the serial number range of his receiver. He found original screws, pins, and springs from various sources, ensuring that every component of the restored rifle would be period correct and authentic. The only non-original part was the stock he had made himself, but this is considered acceptable in professional restoration circles, as long as the new stock is made to original specifications using period-appropriate materials and techniques. When Walter fitted the final component into place and closed the bolt on his restored Springfield, he felt a profound sense of accomplishment that he hadn't experienced in years. 1 week after being told to throw his rifle in the trash, Walter Hensley drove back to Precision Arms with the restored Springfield, wrapped in a clean wool blanket on the seat beside him. His hands were still stained with linseed oil and bluing solution, his back ached from hours bent over his workbench, and he hadn't slept more than 4 hours on any night during the entire project. But there was a lightness in his step that hadn't been there in years, a reminder that he still had value, that his skills still mattered, that age had not erased everything he had spent a lifetime building. When he walked through the doors of the gun shop, Tyler Brennan was sitting behind the counter in the exact same position, scrolling through the exact same phone, wearing the exact same expression of bored entitlement. "Oh," Tyler said, barely glancing up. "You're back. Let me guess. You want a second opinion? I told you. That thing is—" Walter unwrapped the rifle and laid it on the counter. Tyler's words died in his throat. His phone clattered to the floor, forgotten, as he stared at the rifle before him. The metal gleamed with a deep, flawless blue finish that seemed almost impossible. The walnut stock was perfectly shaped, its grain rich and warm under the shop lights, its finish smooth as glass. The bolt worked with mechanical precision, sliding home with a satisfying click that spoke of proper timing and expert fitting. Every detail was correct, from the properly staked rear sight to the appropriate markings on the barrel. Tyler reached out to touch the receiver, then pulled his hand back, as if afraid he might damage something precious. This can't be the same rifle," he stammered. "This is impossible. No one could do this in a week. No one could do this at all." Walter allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. "You'd be surprised what experience can accomplish, son." Word spread quickly through the gun shop and beyond. Other customers gathered around to examine the restoration, and several of them recognized the work for what it was: museum-quality craftsmanship that represented the absolute pinnacle of the gunsmith's art. One customer, a retired Marine officer who collected military firearms, immediately asked Walter if he would consider selling. "I'll give you $12,000 right now," the man offered, pulling out his checkbook. "This is the finest restoration I've ever seen, and I've been collecting for 30 years. Walter politely declined. He hadn't done this for money. He hadn't even done it to prove the young gunsmith wrong. though he couldn't deny a certain satisfaction in that outcome. He had done it because the rifle deserved it, because craftsmanship matters, because some things are worth saving regardless of how much time or effort they require. Tyler Brennan stood behind his counter with his face flushed red with embarrassment, watching an old man in worn overalls receive praise and admiration from customers who had walked past Tyler 100 times without ever looking twice. The young gunsmith had spent 3 years building a reputation based on tactical modifications and custom builds, work that was competent but unremarkable. In 1 week, this elderly stranger had demonstrated a level of skill that Tyler couldn't hope to match with years of additional training. Worse, Tyler knew that his dismissive behavior had been witnessed by everyone in the shop. His arrogance, his condescension, his assumption that age meant incompetence, all of it had been publicly exposed and refuted. For a long moment, Tyler simply stood there, struggling with his pride, wrestling with the question of whether to double down on his ego or admit his mistake. Then, slowly, he walked around the counter and approached Walter with his eyes lowered. "Sir," Tyler said quietly, "I owe you an apology. What I said last week was disrespectful and ignorant. I judged your abilities based on your appearance, and I was completely wrong." He paused, swallowing hard. "This restoration is extraordinary. I've never seen anything like it. Would you be willing to teach me? I thought I knew this craft, but looking at your work, I realize I don't know anything at all." It was perhaps the most difficult admission Tyler had ever made, but watching the old man receive the rifle back with tender, practiced hands, Tyler understood that his own education had barely begun. The technical school certificate on his wall suddenly seemed like a child's participation trophy compared to the knowledge this elderly craftsman carried in his weathered hands. Walter studied the young man for a long moment, seeing past the arrogance to the potential beneath. He had taught many apprentices during his career, had shaped the skills of gunsmiths who now worked in shops and museums across the country. He knew the difference between someone who was unteachable and someone who simply hadn't been taught. "What's your name, son?" Walter asked. "Tyler. Tyler Brennan." "Well, Tyler, I'll tell you what I told every apprentice who ever worked under me. Skill without humility is worthless. The moment you think you know everything is the moment you stop learning. This craft has been refined over centuries by masters who dedicated their entire lives to perfecting it. You can spend 50 years studying and still have more to learn. Are you willing to accept that?" Tyler nodded slowly, genuine respect finally showing in his eyes. "Yes, sir, I am." Walter smiled, and for the first time in years he felt the stirring of a purpose beyond simply waiting to die. Here is something worth understanding about craftsmanship and why it matters in a world increasingly dominated by mass production and disposable goods. When Walter Hensley restored that 1903 Springfield, he wasn't just fixing a broken object. He was participating in a tradition that stretches back thousands of years, connecting himself to every craftsman who ever took raw materials and transformed them into something functional and beautiful. The rifle he restored will outlast him, will outlast Tyler Brennan, will potentially survive for another century as a testament to what human hands can accomplish with sufficient skill and dedication. In an age when most objects are designed for obsolescence, when things are meant to be used briefly and then discarded, there is profound value in work that endures. The young gunsmith learned more than technical skills from his encounter with Walter. He learned that true expertise demands humility, that appearances often deceive, and that the most valuable knowledge often resides in people the world has written off as obsolete. Over the following months, Walter began visiting Precision Arms regularly, sharing his knowledge with Tyler and other young gunsmiths who heard about the legendary restoration. What had started as an insult transformed into mentorship, as Walter found renewed purpose in passing along skills he had feared would die with him. He taught them techniques that weren't in any textbook, methods refined through decades of trial and error, secrets of the craft that existed only in the memories of masters who were rapidly disappearing. Tyler, for his part, proved to be an eager student once his ego got out of the way. He learned to see firearms differently, not as collections of parts, but as integrated systems requiring holistic understanding. He learned to approach his work with patience and humility, recognizing that every project offered opportunities for learning regardless of how experienced he became. And he learned to never ever judge someone's capabilities based on their appearance. The 1903 Springfield now sits in a place of honor in Walter's workshop, displayed in a glass case beside his workbench where it catches the morning light through the window. He never did discover the rifle's complete history, who carried it in 1918 or how it came to be buried on his property. But he researched the serial number and learned that rifles in that range were shipped to France in the spring of 1918, during the German Spring Offensive when American forces first entered combat in significant numbers. Somewhere, over 100 years ago, a young American soldier had carried this rifle through the trenches of the Western Front. Perhaps he survived and brought it home as a souvenir. Perhaps it passed through many hands before ending up buried in Virginia clay. The full story will never be known, but the rifle itself endures as a connection to that history, preserved by the skill of a craftsman who refused to accept that anything was beyond saving. Walter Hensley passed away peacefully in his sleep 2 years after completing the restoration, at the age of 80. His obituary in the local paper mentioned his military service and his long career as a government contractor, though security restrictions prevented any detailed description of his actual accomplishments. But for those who knew him, who had seen his work, who had learned from his expertise, the tributes told a fuller story. Tyler Brennan delivered a eulogy at Walter's funeral, describing how an old man in worn overalls had taught him that true mastery requires humility, that appearances mean nothing compared to ability, and that the greatest teachers often come in the most unexpected forms. The 1903 Springfield, per Walter's wishes, was donated to the Virginia Military Institute's museum, where it now serves as both a historical artifact and a teaching example of master-level restoration. A small plaque beside the display tells visitors the story of how it was restored, though it necessarily omits the details of Walter's classified career. Students and visitors who stop to examine the rifle rarely understand the full significance of what they're seeing, but every once in a while an old veteran will pause before the display, recognize the quality of the work and smile with understanding. They know. They remember. They understand that some things are worth saving and some skills are worth honouring, and some people deserve respect regardless of how they appear to the casual eye. Tyler Brennan still runs Precision Arms, but the shop has changed significantly since that fateful day when he told an old man to throw a rifle in the trash. The walls now display photographs of historical restorations alongside the tactical rifles and custom builds. Tyler has become known for his willingness to tackle projects that other gunsmiths dismiss as impossible, applying lessons learned from a mentor who appeared in his life like an answered prayer he hadn't known he'd prayed. He keeps a framed photograph of Walter on his workbench, a reminder of the day his education truly began. And whenever a young employee dismisses a customer based on appearance, Tyler tells them the story of the old man in worn overalls who proved that skill knows no age, that experience deserves respect, and that the most dangerous assumption is believing you have nothing left to learn. If this story moved you, if you believe that craftsmanship and experience deserve honour in a world that too often discards both, if you want to hear more stories about ordinary people with extraordinary skills who refuse to accept limits that others impose upon them, then I hope you'll consider subscribing to this channel. Every subscription helps us share these stories of hidden expertise and quiet dignity with people who need to be reminded that value doesn't diminish with age. Every comment tells us that the old ways, the patient ways, the skilled ways still matter in this modern world, and every share extends these lessons to someone who might need to hear them. Walter Hensley spent a lifetime mastering his craft, then spent his final years passing that knowledge to the next generation. His hands are still now, but the skills he taught continue in workshops and schools and museums across the country. That's the true measure of a craftsman, not what they build for themselves, but what they build in others. Subscribe if you believe in craftsmanship. Share if you believe in respect. And the next time someone dismisses an old man's abilities, remember, you might be looking at a master.